We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was such a revolutionary statement at the time. You know why? Because we shattered that old paradigm, that old philosophy. And effectively, I go to the whiteboard, I take the eraser, and I erase the word king off the board. I erase all the arrows that went down from the king to the people and the subjects, and I erase the word the subjects. The only two words left on the board, three words, God and the people. So then I draw all the arrows straight down to the people. And I step back and I say, that, my friends, is the root of our Judeo-Christian heritage. That is the root of the truth that made us the greatest nation in the history of the world. That's it. Many years after the founding, Abraham Lincoln famously summarized it in the Gettysburg Address. He said, "We are dedicated to this proposition that we are one nation."
You witness what we are witnessing, watching Mike Johnson take that eraser to the whiteboard and draw his arrows from God straight down to the people, watching him theatrically perform this eliminationist cosmology for a cheering crowd, and the breath catches in your throat, because you realize with a visceral shock that this is no abstract culture war skirmish. This is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, standing second in line to the presidency, articulating a vision of American governance that explicitly excludes anyone who doesn't fit his narrow theological framework. And what makes this moment so particularly dangerous is the way he cloaks his Christian nationalist authoritarianism in the language of the Declaration of Independence itself, weaponizing Jefferson's words about inalienable rights, while simultaneously rejecting Jefferson's actual wall of separation between church and state. Johnson has called the separation of church and state a misnomer. Explaining it comes from a letter Jefferson wrote, and is not in the Constitution, arguing they did not want the government to encroach upon the church, not that they didn't want principles of faith to have influence on our public life. And watching this clip, you see him go even further, constructing an entire historical narrative where divine authority flows directly to the American people through what he calls our Judeo-Christian heritage, as if 250 years of constitutional democracy were merely incidental to some preordained theocratic blueprint. But here's the bombshell that should make your blood run cold, because Johnson's ties to far-right Christian movements are unprecedented for a lawmaker in such a high position of authority, and we're not talking about some mild-mannered evangelical who happens to pray before meals. We're talking about someone who has said the New Apostolic Reformation has had a profound influence on his life, a shadowy movement that promotes extremist calls for Christians to conquer and take dominion over key mountains of society, including business realms, the media, and governments. This is dominionism dressed up in Founding Fathers cosplay. This is theocratic ambition masquerading as constitutional originalism, and the sheer audacity of it would be laughable if it weren't so terrifyingly effective at mobilizing a base that has been conditioned for decades to believe they are simultaneously the rightful inheritors of American power and the most persecuted minority in the nation. What Johnson does in this clip reveals the fundamental mechanism of Christian nationalist propaganda, the way it collapses pluralism into hierarchy and rebrands exclusion as liberation. He erases the king from his whiteboard, and everyone cheers because yes, we all agree monarchy is tyranny. But then watch what he does next. Watch how he reduces the entire architecture of American democracy to just three words, God and the people, as if those arrows flowing downward don't require any mediating institutions, any checks and balances, any protection for minority rights or dissenting voices. In Johnson's cosmology, there's no need for the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, because God is already established. There's no room for religious pluralism, because Christianity has already been designated as the source code of American identity. There's no possibility of secular citizenship, because to be truly American in this framework is to acknowledge this direct pipeline from the Christian God to the American people, and everyone else, every Muslim and Hindu and Jew and atheist and agnostic, every person who practices a different faith or no faith at all, becomes at best a guest in their own country, and at worst an existential threat to the nation's very foundation. And here's where it gets even more sinister, even more urgently dangerous, because Johnson knows exactly what he's doing. Johnson has known David Barton for at least a quarter century, and said at a Christian lawmakers event 2 years ago that Barton has had a profound influence on me, and my work, and my life, and everything I do, and David Barton is the pseudo-historian Christian nationalist, has repeatedly demonized LGBTQ persons and communities, and argued against aspects of the 13th Amendment, insisting there is a biblical defense for slavery. Let that sink in for a moment. The Speaker of the House drawing his intellectual sustenance from someone who believes slavery has biblical justification, someone who has devoted his career to rewriting American history as an explicitly Christian founding narrative, despite all evidence to the contrary. When Johnson invokes the Declaration of Independence in this clip, when he quotes endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, he's not celebrating universal human dignity, he's laying claim to those rights exclusively for people who share his theological commitments. He's arguing that rights don't come from our common humanity or from democratic self-governance, but from his particular conception of God, which means those rights can be granted or withheld based on adherence to his particular conception of Christian orthodoxy. Religious liberty expert Amanda Tyler describes Christian nationalism as the single biggest threat to religious freedom in the United States today, noting it is antithetical to the constitutional ideal that belonging in American society is not predicated on what faith one practices or whether someone is religious at all. And watching Johnson perform his whiteboard theatrics, you can see exactly why. Because he's not making an argument for religious freedom, he's making an argument for religious supremacy. The arrows on his diagram don't flow to all Americans equally, they flow to the people who recognize God's authority, which in his framework means Christians who share his interpretation of what Christian faith demands politically. This is the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook, claiming to speak for the people while simultaneously defining the people in increasingly narrow and exclusionary terms, until the people becomes identical with the party, with the movement, with the dear leader and his ideological enforcers. Now let me drop another bombshell on you about what's happening right this moment, because just this year Johnson argued Americans have been misled about separation of church and state after the IRS lifted its ban on churches endorsing political candidates, claiming those who insist on keeping church and state separate are unaware. The phrase derives from Jefferson's letter rather than the Constitution. This is the Christian nationalist project in real time. This is the systematic dismantling of the wall between church and state that has protected both religious freedom and democratic governance for 2.5 centuries. And they're doing it by deliberately misreading history and deliberately misunderstanding what the founders actually intended. Jefferson's wall of separation wasn't some throwaway line in private correspondence. It was his interpretation of the First Amendment's meaning, an interpretation that has been upheld by courts for generations, precisely because it protects everyone's freedom to believe or not believe without government coercion. But Johnson wants to reverse that understanding entirely. Johnson claims the founders very deliberately listed religious liberty, the free exercise of religion, as the first freedom protected in the Bill of Rights, because they wanted everyone to freely live out their faith, as that would ensure a robust presence of moral virtue in the public square, and calls on courts to ensure religious principles and viewpoints are not separate from public affairs. This is sophistical nonsense masquerading as constitutional analysis, because the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause work together precisely to create a space where everyone can practice their faith without the government picking winners and losers, without one religious tradition receiving the state's imprimatur, and all others being relegated to second-class status. What Johnson is advocating is exactly what the founders feared, the fusion of religious authority with political power that had caused centuries of bloodshed in Europe, and that they desperately wanted to avoid in the new American Republic. You need to understand the intellectual genealogy here, the ecosystem of Christian nationalist thought that produced Mike Johnson and continues to support him, because Johnson is part of a growing cohort of far-right Republican lawmakers who have embraced the Christian nationalist movement, and has deeply tied himself into networks of Christian extremists, whose rhetoric, leadership, and warfare theology fueled a literal insurrection. This is not hyperbole, this is documented fact. As Speaker, Johnson played an instrumental role in trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election in order to keep former President Donald Trump in the White House. In the weeks before January 6th, New Apostolic Reformation leaders implored Christians to mobilize for Trump's reinstatement as president, and Johnson took part in the prayer campaign. The arrows on Johnson's whiteboard don't just flow from God to the people, they flow from God to Trump to the Christian nationalist faithful, who stormed the Capitol with crosses and Jesus Saves banners, who prayed for divine intervention to overturn a democratic election, who believed they were holy warriors defending God's chosen nation from secular corruption. And here's the part that should terrify anyone who cares about democracy, because the rising influence of Christian nationalism poses a major threat to the health of our democracy, and the major battle lines of the culture war are being drawn between a right animated by a Christian nationalist worldview and Americans who embrace the country's growing racial and religious diversity. This isn't just about religion, this is about who gets to be fully American, who gets to participate in public life as equals, who gets to shape the nation's future. Research shows that Christian nationalist views intersect with white identity, anti-black sentiment, support of patriarchy, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim sentiments, anti-immigrant attitudes, authoritarianism, and support for violence, which means when Johnson draws those arrows from God to the people, he's not drawing them to a diverse pluralistic democracy, he's drawing them to a specific vision of white Christian America, where everyone else exists on sufferance. Look at how Johnson frames this in the clip, describing his whiteboard exercise as revealing the root of our Judeo-Christian heritage and the root of the truth that made us the greatest nation in the history of the world. This is American exceptionalism fused with theological triumphalism. This is the claim that America's greatness derives not from its democratic institutions or its constitutional protections or its embrace of diversity, but from its Christian identity, and the obvious corollary is that to maintain that greatness, we must maintain that Christian identity. We must ensure that God remains at the top of Johnson's diagram, with arrows flowing downward to a properly Christian people. It's worth noting that Johnson says Judeo-Christian, rather than simply Christian, deploying that politically convenient formulation that lets Christian nationalists claim they're being inclusive, while still maintaining Christianity as the dominant tradition. But the real bombshell is what this formulation excludes, namely every other religious and philosophical tradition that has contributed to American democracy, every Enlightenment principle of reason and individual rights that the founders drew upon, every secular and humanist voice that has fought for justice and equality throughout our history. We must be absolutely clear about what Christian nationalism actually is and what it actually threatens, because Christian nationalism is an ideology that desires a close fusion of a particular expression of Christianity with American civic life, and demands that all levels of our government vigorously defend this ideology as central to our national identity, public policy, and social belonging. This is not about religious people participating in politics, which is everyone's right, and which enriches our democratic discourse. This is about using government power to privilege one religious tradition over all others, to enshrine one theological worldview as the official American ideology, to transform religious belief from a private matter of conscience protected by the Constitution into a public test of citizenship enforced by the state. The Christian nationalist vision has little tolerance for diversity or for the full participation of all people, and this underscores the threat Christian nationalism poses to democracy. Consider the timing of this rhetoric and its escalation in recent years, because what we're witnessing isn't just Johnson being himself, it's the normalization of extremism at the highest levels of government. Scholar Matthew Taylor notes that this fringe evangelical wing has become so influential, it can't be ignored, and while he doesn't see Mike Johnson as some sort of like, oh man, he is really a crazy person from the margins, he argues he's just a signal of what it looks like to be a right-wing Christian politician these days, meaning that Johnson's Christian nationalism isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's what the Republican Party now demands from its leaders as proof of ideological purity. The fact that someone with ties to figures who have described the New Apostolic Reformation as having a profound influence on their life now sits second in line to the presidency represents a fundamental shift in American politics, a shift away from pluralistic democracy and toward theocratic authoritarianism, and we need to talk about the performative aspect of this clip, the way Johnson turns his constitutional interpretation into a children's Sunday school lesson, complete with whiteboard and eraser and dramatic gestures, because this is Christian nationalism as pedagogical spectacle. This is the transmission of an exclusionary ideology through the comforting aesthetics of education and historical explanation. He erases the king and everyone cheers. He erases the subjects and everyone cheers. And by the time he's drawn his arrows from God to the people, the audience has been conditioned to accept his framing, to see his three-word diagram as capturing some essential truth about American governance that secular historians and constitutional scholars have somehow missed or deliberately hidden. This is conspiracy thinking masquerading as revelation. The idea that there's a simple truth about America's founding that the elites don't want you to know, and that truth just happens to be that Christian theological authority should supersede democratic deliberation. What makes this particularly insidious is how Johnson appropriates the language of equality and rights while gutting those concepts of their universal meaning. When he quotes all men are created equal and says they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, he's taking words that have been progressively expanded over centuries to include more and more people, words that have been wielded by abolitionists and suffragists and civil rights activists to demand inclusion and justice, and he's trying to collapse all that emancipatory history back into a narrow theological framework where rights come from his God according to his interpretation. The atheist has no rights in Johnson's diagram. The Muslim has no rights in Johnson's diagram. Anyone who doesn't acknowledge the Christian God as the source of American political authority has no legitimate place in Johnson's vision of the American political community, and that is fundamentally incompatible with constitutional democracy. Now here's another bombshell that connects all of this to the broader authoritarian project, because critics argue that initiatives like Project 2025 would create an authoritarian Christian nationalist state by expanding presidential power and promoting conservative Christian values, and represent a serious threat to democracy, the rule of law, civil rights, and the separation of church and state. Johnson's whiteboard performance isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a comprehensive strategy to reshape American government according to Christian nationalist principles, to fill administrative agencies and courts with ideological enforcers, to gut civil rights protections and establish religious doctrine as the basis for public policy. Project 2025 is informed by an overarching assumption that U.S. law, government, and policy should be informed by Christian nationalist teachings and morality, and showing no regard for how diverse faith traditions approach key questions, it adopts one particular Christian theological political worldview as the default. The arrows on Johnson's whiteboard flow from this conception of God directly to these policy outcomes, from theological assertion to legal restriction, from religious supremacy to democratic dismantling. When he says this direct God-to-people relationship is the root of the truth that made us the greatest nation in the history of the world, he's making a claim that has profound implications for who belongs and who doesn't, whose rights count and whose don't, whose voices matter and whose can be dismissed. Christian nationalism jettisons the principle of democratic equality, and for Christian nationalists only certain people are considered legitimate citizens of a country, and those are the people who champion the Christian nationalist cause. We must also interrogate the deeply racialized history embedded in Christian nationalism, because when Johnson talks about Judeo-Christian heritage making America great, he's invoking a tradition that has historically been bound up with white supremacy and the maintenance of racial hierarchies. The Christianity that Johnson claims as America's founding principle is not the liberation theology of black churches that fought for civil rights. It's not the social gospel that advocated for the poor and marginalized. It's the Christianity that justified slavery and segregation and continues to this day to resist racial justice. Congressional leaders have noted that Christian nationalists are zeroed in on defeating democracy, and that violence is a feature, not a bug, of this movement. And we saw that violence erupt on January 6 when Christian nationalist ideology provided both motivation and justification for an attempted coup. The cheering audience in this clip needs to understand what they're cheering for, because when Johnson draws his arrows from God to the people, he's not empowering them, he's conscripting them into a hierarchical system where theological authorities get to determine what God wants, and everyone else is expected to fall in line. This is the opposite of democratic self-governance. This is the opposite of individual conscience and religious freedom. This is substituting one king for another and calling it liberation. The genius of the American founding wasn't that it substituted God for the king. It was that it established popular sovereignty mediated through constitutional structures and protected by enforceable rights, creating a system where no one, not kings nor priests nor presidents, could claim divine sanction for their political authority. But Johnson and the Christian nationalist movement he represents want to undo all of that. They want to return to a pre-modern conception of political legitimacy, where religious orthodoxy determines civic standing, where theological correctness becomes the measure of patriotism, where the wall between church and state gets erased just as thoroughly as Johnson erases the king from his whiteboard. Progressive Christian leaders describe Christian nationalism as an ideology that conflates American identity with Christian identity and rejects the separation of church and state, calling it nothing short of a weapon of mass destruction against core values of the gospel. And that last point is crucial, because Christian nationalism doesn't just threaten democracy, it corrupts Christianity itself, turning it from a prophetic voice for justice into an instrument of political domination. Consider what Johnson is really arguing when he says America shattered the old paradigm by putting God above the people instead of the king. He's claiming that American democracy is fundamentally theocratic, that it requires acknowledgement of divine authority as a prerequisite for political participation, that rights don't flow from our common humanity or our democratic institutions, but from a specific conception of God that just happens to align with his particular brand of conservative evangelical Christianity. This is a historical nonsense that would have appalled most of the founders, including Jefferson himself, wrote in his famous 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists about the First Amendment creating a wall of separation between church and state. Jefferson understood what Johnson refuses to acknowledge, that religious freedom requires keeping government power separate from religious authority, that the moment you establish one faith tradition as the official foundation of national identity, you imperil everyone who practices a different faith or no faith at all. But Johnson has made his position on Jefferson's wall abundantly clear. While Johnson started this year with a fake Jefferson prayer, he later dismissed as ridiculous the actual words of Jefferson when it comes to church-state separation. This is intellectual dishonesty of the highest order, cherry-picking Jefferson when he mentions a creator in the Declaration, but dismissing him when he articulates the separation of church and state, using the founders when they support your ideology and ignoring them when they contradict it. And the audience cheers because they've been conditioned to see this not as contradiction, but as revelation, not as historical distortion, but as truth-telling, not as the establishment of religious supremacy, but as the restoration of America's authentic identity. Here's what's at stake in this moment, and why we must resist this Christian nationalist vision with every tool at our disposal. Because recent analysis shows Christian nationalism embraces the idea that Christians alone should govern the United States, and it graphically portrays the threat posed by Christian nationalism, and especially white Christian nationalism, to American democracy. Every time Johnson draws his diagram, every time he gets a cheering crowd to accept his eliminationist cosmology, he normalizes the idea that America belongs to Christians first and everyone else second. He advances the proposition that religious identity should determine political rights. He moves us closer to a theocratic future, where the arrows on his whiteboard become the actual structure of government, with Christian authorities claiming to speak for God and everyone else reduced to subjects dependent on their benevolence. The fight against Christian nationalism is the fight for pluralistic democracy itself. It's the fight for a nation where you don't have to pass a religious test to be fully American, where secular citizens and religious minorities have exactly the same rights and standing as the Christian majority, where government remains neutral on questions of theology while protecting everyone's right to believe or not believe according to their conscience. The defense of democracy requires committing to the defense of religious liberty for all, recognizing that Americans of any faith or of no faith have the right and responsibility to participate equally in our democracy, and understanding that we all deserve to have a say, not just those who embrace the particular expression of Christianity held by Christian nationalism. When Johnson erases the king from his whiteboard, he's performing a sleight of hand, making you focus on the elimination of monarchy, while he simultaneously establishes a new form of religious authoritarianism. The real revolutionary act of the American founding wasn't replacing the king with God, it was replacing the king with the people themselves, with democratic institutions and constitutional limitations, and a radical commitment to equality under law, regardless of religious belief. Johnson wants to undo that revolution. He wants to establish his arrows from God as the true structure of American governance, and he's doing it with a smile and a whiteboard and the language of liberty, while actually advocating for a system of religious supremacy that would make the founders weep. So we must name what this is. We must call it out as the threat it represents. We must organize and mobilize and educate and resist at every level, from local school boards to state legislatures, to Congress, to the courts. We must defend the wall of separation that Jefferson described, and that generations of Americans have fought to maintain. We must insist on a pluralistic democracy, where everyone belongs regardless of their faith tradition or lack thereof. We must refuse to let Christian nationalists rewrite American history as an explicitly Christian project when the Constitution itself contains no religious test, and when the First Amendment explicitly prohibits the establishment of religion. We must build coalitions across faith traditions and across the religious-secular divide, bringing together everyone who believes in democratic equality against those who would establish religious hierarchy. The audience cheering for Johnson in this clip needs to understand they're not cheering for religious freedom, they're cheering for religious supremacy. They're not celebrating democracy, they're celebrating theocracy. They're not honoring the founders, they're betraying everything the founders actually built. And those of us who see this clearly, who understand what's happening and what's at stake, we have the urgent responsibility to make the case for genuine pluralism, for authentic democracy, for a nation where the arrows don't flow from Johnson's God to Johnson's people, but where power ultimately resides in all of us equally, in our collective capacity for self-governance, in our shared commitment to justice and liberty for every single person, regardless of how or whether they worship. This is the fight of our generation, and it's a fight we cannot afford to lose, because once you establish religious authority as the basis for political legitimacy, once you draw those arrows from God to some subset of the people defined by theological correctness, You've abandoned democracy in favor of theocracy. You've replaced equality with hierarchy. You've transformed rights from universal guarantees into conditional privileges. Johnson stands at that whiteboard performing Christian nationalism for a cheering crowd, and we must stand in opposition, armed with historical truth and constitutional principle and moral clarity, refusing to let him erase 2.5 centuries of pluralistic democracy as casually as he erases the king from his board, insisting instead on a future where everyone belongs, where no one's faith or lack thereof determines their citizenship, where the American experiment in democratic self-governance continues its long arc toward fuller and more inclusive justice for all,